All right, everybody. So we are starting a new unit right now, and we're going to be moving on from Bacon's Rebellion, and we're going to get on this what I call the road to the revolution. So what we're going to notice is that every single thing that we talk about now, all these different acts, which are like new taxes placed on the colonists, there's going to be different instances that are going to lead up to the American Revolution. So it's going to be like an event after an event after an event, and all of these are going to be driving a wedge in between the British and the colonists that will become the American colonists until finally there's going to be no choice but a revolution that's going to break out. But we're going to look at what were the motives behind the American colonist, the certain elites in the American colonist. But our goal for today, we want to be able to explain how the consequences of the French and Indian War helped start this road to the revolution. So there's going to be a lot of consequences from this French and Indian War. We want to be able to see how that started this road to the American Revolution. So we start out by looking at this thing called salutary neglect. So salutary neglect. So throughout the 1700s, England was occupied in these wars between France and Spain in Europe. So England was fighting many wars against Spain and France, which was their rivals in Europe. And so they decided to let the North American colonies govern themselves. So these 13 colonies that I have listed in your notes, these are the 13 original colonies. And the British government decided to let them kind of run themselves it was cheaper and more efficient for the British to let them just kind of govern themselves. But because of this, the land-owning elites and the merchants took power in the colonies, and they did everything they could to expand their power and wealth over the colonies. So because the British government put certain people in charge, they put the elites in charge. And these elites realized, hey, we can expand our power and expand our profits because the British aren't going to really do anything about it. So this next big issue that we're going to see is geography. So when I say geography, I'm meaning the fact that England and the colonies were over 3,000 miles apart. And so because they were so far apart, there was the Atlantic Ocean in between them, and it would take weeks to travel from England to the colonies. So this distance created a sense of independence among the colonists. And so the elites were able to set up these different legislatures or governments to control each individual colony. So kind of like how we have the government in each state today, they set up forms of government similar to that, but they were the ones that were in charge of it, and they had the say-so over the colonies. And so this first act that we're going to get to is called the Navigation Act, also known as British mercantilism. So if you remember from our freshman year, we learned about the British economic system, which was mercantilism, which was where England controls who the colonies can trade with and how much they are taxed. And so these navigation acts were set up to control who the colonies could buy from, and it pushed the colonies to only buy British goods instead of the other countries. So this kept the colonies dependent on England, and it would prevent the colonies from ever becoming too powerful or independent. So this system was set up to keep the colonies dependent on England for everything, while England just made tons of profit off of the colonies. And so this started to cause the colonies to rebel against the British, and it bred more corruption in the colonies. So the colonists over time are getting tired of this. So they're going to end up fighting back little by little. Another cause of issues was the Enlightenment. So we also talked about our freshman year dealing with Enlightenment. It was that time period when people began to question the role of government and who should be in charge of the government. So they started questioning the power of the king, the absolute rule of the king. And so this belief of they also had this belief of natural rights, which was, life, liberty, and property. And so this helped push the belief that colonies could be independent and a push towards revolution for freedom. So all of these enlightened ideas led to the colonists wanting to push for more independence and towards freedom and a revolution away from England. And so then we get to this French and Indian War, which in Europe, it's also known as the 7 Years' War. So this was a global war between England and France. It was almost like the very first ever world war. So not only was there fighting on the North American continent, there was fighting in Europe, there was fighting in Africa, there was fighting in Asia, they were fighting all over the world, and it was between England and France. Even though it says French and Indian War, it's really the French versus the British. So England and the colonies, they aligned with many Native American groups to fight France. So the English and the French both had Native Americans that fought on either side, but the British also had the American colonies on their side as well to fight the French. And fun fact, George Washington actually commanded the Continental Army for the British. So he was in charge at only 21. He was in charge of the colonial army that fought against the French, which he was in many ways an epic failure, but we'll get to that. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, and you're going to notice there's going to be a lot of Treaty of Parises. We mentioned a couple last year dealing with World War I and World War II. And we're going to have the Treaty of Paris. So this gave Britain control of the majority of North America. So because of the French and Indian War, because England won, they ended up gaining control of the majority of North America. So let's talk about the results of the French and Indian War. So during the war, England actually borrowed large amounts of money so that they could fight the French and win the war. But because of these huge debts, the British believed that the colonists should pay for the war since the British were protecting the American colonists. So they said, you know what, we protected you during this war. You know, we are continuing to protect you, so you should pay for it. And how do you get them to pay for it? You raise your taxes. So this resulted in many new taxes against the colonies. And so the colonists, they were outraged and they were angry, and this laid the foundation for the upcoming revolution. But while all this was going on, this event called Pontiac's Rebellion, which was dealing with the Native American groups in the Ohio Valley right there along the border of the original colonies. So because the French and Indian War came to such a quick end after so many years of fighting, the French ended up giving up most of their lands to the Native Americans that the Native Americans were on. And so these Native American groups started to worry about whether they would remain independent. So the French had really just kind of let the Indians do whatever they wanted. And so the Native Americans were really worried now that the French weren't in control and it was the British. And so the Native Americans' overall goal was to maintain their independence and their land. But without telling the Native Americans, the French just gave away all of their lands to the British after they lost the war. And this created that huge threat that I mentioned to the natives. And so this rebellion lasted for many years between a large group of Native American tribes and the British. And it was known as Pontiac's Rebellion because Chief Pontiac was a chief of the Iroquois nation. And so it ended though, or it didn't end, but the British government, they made this thing called the Proclamation of 1763. So the Proclamation of 1763. And so this prevented any English settling west of the Appalachian Mountains, and it would reserve the lands exclusively for the natives. So the British tried to kind of make a treaty or a truce and say, you know what, we're going to keep all the lands east of the Appalachian Mountains, where pretty much the original colonies are located. But in return, y'all will have all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. And as much as we, come to expect, the British didn't enforce this law at all, and many colonists settled west of the line and simply just took native lands. They couldn't get the natives to agree to sell, they just took it from them. And so George Washington, ironically enough, was one of those elite landowners who stole native lands for his own and kept it a secret from the British government. So, yeah, the first president of the United States ends up taking his slaves that he owned as well and expanding and taking, thousands of acres of land for his own. And he didn't pay for it. He just took it and said, this is mine now. And they had to keep it secret because technically it was illegal. So this proclamation just served to further heighten the tensions between the settlers and the Native Americans. So because the English didn't really bother enforcing their own law, this caused a heightened tension, so more anger between the British and the natives. So let's talk about the effects of the French and Indian War on the colonies and the natives. So because of the Proclamation of 1763, we already have this big kind of tension brewing already. But the French and Indian War not only redrew the map of the world in North America, but it also created these dramatic changes within the American colonies. So not only did it redraw the map of who had what territory, but it also changed the American colonies within. So the war caused more settlers to turn against the Native Americans. So the Native Americans, the settlers started to turn against the Native Americans even more than they already were. And so the settlers started killing Native Americans. So the colonial government was finally forced to remove the natives from their own land. So the settlers went in, ended up taking the land from the natives that was already promised to the natives, and then ended up killing them until they finally ended up leaving the rest of their land. So it's like the settlers just never had enough. They just wanted more and more and more. Common theme, isn't it? But anyway, also during this time is when the colonial identities started to really form. And so the colonists emerged from the French and Indian War with a new sense of collective identity. So how they identified with one another. They all felt a common bond. So before the war, the colonies were largely apart from one another. But now they were pushing to have a meeting of delegates from all the colonies to decide how to raise taxes and how to deal with the Native Americans. So they started to feel more and more independent of England. And so they called this meeting and this delegates the Albany Plan of Union, and they met in 1754, so right during the middle of the French and Indian War. But this plan was rejected because it would give too much power to the people. So God forbid that. Can't have that. But overall, though, the fighting in the war created this sense of patriotism that the colonists had felt for being a British subject. So the colonists felt this sense of pride for being able to fight for England against the French, which is ironic because, less than 10 years later, that would completely disappear. And they would end up fighting against the British less than 10 years later. And so as you see over here on the left side of the screen, there is this first ever, I call it America's First meme. So this was drawn by Benjamin Franklin during this Albany Plan of Union. And it's a political cartoon, it's a meme. He's talking about how the colonists have to join together or they'll die. So it's really ironic that this was propaganda, this political cartoons, and this was in 1754. And so we move on to the fact that the elites, they started to realize that independence from England meant that they could have more profits. So the elites started to realize that between the end of the French and Indian War and 1776, the elites realized that by creating their own nation, they could end up taking land, profits, and political power away from the British. So these colonists realized that, hey, we already are starting to feel independent of England. And if we completely break away, then we don't have to keep paying a portion of our profits to England in taxes. We can just keep all the money for ourselves. And so they started to drift away from England and they started to figure out how this could happen. So while creating this nation, they would be able to put down many rebellions and create popular support for a select privileged few to control all the power. And newsflash, this has been the last 200 years of the US history. This is our US history in a nutshell. A select few group of people are in power over all of us, and they do it through popular support. Isn't that crazy? But by the eve of the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1776, the leadership saw that they could channel this rebellious energy towards the British under the guise of fighting for freedom. So, in between the French and Indian War ending in 1763 and the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1776, the elite leadership, they saw that they could take all of this energy, all this rebelliousness that the colonies had against England, and they could use it for their own good by saying, you know what, we're going to be fighting for freedom, when really those in power just wanted to break away from England so that they could have all the power, not have to share it. And so after the British defeated the French in 1763, all that was left was to get rid of the British forces so that the American elite could have all their power, just like I just said. And so the British need more power, and the colonists need less British control. So after the French and Indian War, the British needed to tighten control over the colonies, and they needed money to pay for the war. So the British, they needed more control over the colonies because they needed this money to help pay off their debts. But the American leadership, the elites on the American side, they didn't need that. They wanted less control of, they needed less English control. They needed more independence. And so these two desires were like just two immovable objects running into each other. Eventually there's going to be conflict. So it's like smashing two rocks together. Nobody's going to win, and eventually it's going to cause a conflict. And so we start looking at these, how they're going to respond, and it's going to be taxes, laws, and more taxes. So it says, prior to 1764, the British left the colonists alone to govern themselves. But by 1764, the year after the French and Indian War ended, this all is going to change. And the way that this first starts to change is we're going to look at the Currency Act. And so the Currency Act banned American colonies from issuing their own forms of money. So the American colonies could not issue their own money. They had to issue British pounds. So that was what a British dollar was called, a pound. And so this made it harder for colonists to borrow money or to pay off debts because there was a lot less money in circulation. And so this caused outrage among the colonists. So that's the Currency Act. Then we move on to the Quartering Act and what's going to be known as the Sugar Act. But first, the Quartering Act. So that forced the colonists to provide food and shelter to British soldiers. So even if it's your own private house, if a British soldier needed somewhere to sleep, you were forced to give up your home. And so the colonists were angry because it was just another way to control them, and they were suspicious of the British for leaving this army in the colonies to enforce these taxes. So the colonists were angry not only because it was a sense of control, but also because this army was sitting right there that could take over at any time. They were worried about that. And so now we move on to the Sugar Act. This is one of the first major acts against the American colonists by the British. So, like I mentioned earlier, an act is a tax placed upon the colonies. So an act, a law. So the Sugar Act was the first ever that was placed on the colonists, like I mentioned, and it places a tax. You have to pay an extra tax on the sugar brought in by the colonists that wasn't from England. So if any kind of sugar was brought in from another country, they had to pay an extra tax on it. So the British thought that, by placing a tax on sugar, that they would end up getting more money, which, as the meme shows, it makes no sense whatsoever because, if they were having an issue with people sneaking in sugar before, placing a tax on it, is that really going to make them go, ooh, now I really don't want sugar because there's a tax on it? No, they're just going to continue sneaking it in. So the purpose of the Sugar Act, it was, because illegal smuggling of sugar, so people sneaking in sugar into the colonies, it was hurting the British ability to earn money. Duh. But So the British thought, we're losing money, so let's place a tax on sugar to gain more money. So we're going to cost people more to bring in sugar, which makes absolutely no sense. But so the reasoning behind this, the British thought was, okay, the cost of the war raised the debt, so they had to make the Americans pay for it, the French and Indian War. So they hoped that restricting trade would give them more control over the colonies, which obviously we see is not going to be working. So the colonists, they responded with outrage. And this is where we first hear that no taxation without representation. So the colonists were outraged that they would be taxed and put on trial for if they were caught smuggling in sugar without having a jury of their peers. They were just, if they were convicted or arrested for smuggling in sugar, they would be sent away for trial. They weren't able to have a trial in their own town. They would be sent far, far away. And so this was the first big protest that the colonists had about the British having a right to tax them. The colonists were like, no, there's no way that this can happen. It's not right, and it's not going to happen. So all this protesting led to the repeal of the Sugar Act. So it was taken away. The Sugar Act was taken away. So the British were so worried about the colonists protesting that they ended up taking away the Sugar Act, which is great and wonderful, except they quickly replaced it with the Stamp Act. So they took away one tax and brought in another tax. So this gets us to the Stamp Act, our last part of our notes, the Stamp Act. So as we mentioned, they took away the Sugar Act, brought in the Stamp Act. And so the British reasoning for it, like I mentioned earlier, they still needed to pay off these war debts from the French and Indian War. So do y'all see how big of a consequence this French and Indian War was, thinking back to our learning goal? So this tax, the Stamp Act, was placed on the colonies that forced any printed material to have a British stamp on it. And if you didn't have that British stamp on it, then it wasn't legitimate. So if you had let's say you were paying your rent with a check, and if it didn't have that British stamp on it, nobody would accept it. And you had to pay a tax to have any kind of paper. And so the British claimed that they had protected the colonists, so this was a way to help pay for their protection, this Stamp Act. They needed to continue raising money. And so the colonists, their reasoning against why this was bad is that the colonists, they said that because they had no representation in Parliament, which is like government, in their Congress, because the colonists had no representation, they didn't have any representatives. So they didn't have a say-so over the tax. And so they said, we're not going to pay your taxes if you don't give us representation. Sounds really, really familiar. But anyway, so they said, we won't pay these taxes unless you give us representation in Congress. And so the colonists, they responded to the Stamp Act. So thousands of colonists burned an effigy, which is like a giant wooden, figure of the tax collector in Boston. So thousands of people got together and carved out this wooden figure that looked like the person who was the tax collector in Boston, and they burned it, which, it's almost like a civil disobedient protest against those in power. Sounds really familiar, doesn't it? I don't know where I've heard this before, but anyway. So it was a symbolic of a protest against the elites in power. So the protest occurred all over the colonies until the tax collectors ended up resigning. So I wonder if they were those were peaceful, nonviolent protesters, but they're all terrorists and all that according to some people. But anyway, so they were so angry because the lower classes were the ones who were feeling the pain of this tax, because the elites were the ones in charge and didn't have to pay any taxes. So those lower class people, the common everyday people, they were angry that they were the ones having to pay this tax, but yet they were the ones that they had no benefit from it. They had no representation, and those in power were not having to pay the tax, so why should they? So we see, thinking back to our original learning target, our learning goal, We wanted to be able to explain how the consequences of the French and Indian War started the road to the Revolution. So as we see, because of this huge debt that the British was able to, that the British had, this huge amount of debt because they spent so much money paying for this war against the French, they now have this huge debt that they have to pay off. And so they're going to start taxing the Americans over and over and over again with a different act, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, all these acts. And finally, it's going to keep continuing to push the colonists away from the British. So the colonists are going to start getting more and more angry and ready to break away from the British. They're finally going to have enough. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you were able to get a lot out of this. And we will discuss this the next time we meet in class. Y'all have a great rest of your day.